the numbers part or the process part first? I'll give you the choice.
I think we need, since we're on this politics kick here, let's talk about how everything is political, because this really annoys me. And to illustrate the politics of this, I've pulled up several articles here, because the narrative through the election, and still to this day, is that Trump did a terrible job responding to COVID. And really to this day, did you see the Biden town hall several days ago? I don't remember.
I just saw clips from it. And most of the stuff I watched was about the incarceration rates and the
one thing
defense.
that jumped out at the one thing that jumped out at me is when he said something to the effect of, "And remember, we didn't have a vaccine when I came into office." Wait, hold on. There is literally video footage of you, Mr. President Biden, getting a vaccine back in December. Things have become so insanely political that a political leader can tell a bald-faced lie when there is literally video evidence showing the opposite, and his supporters will go along with it. Because that's how political.
I think I have a graphic for that. I showed you this earlier. It wasn't supposed to come up now, but is this what you're thinking I was going to bring up?
Yep.
Oh my goodness.
So if you 100%,
101, yeah, and second of all, brainwashing 101 on both sides. Look. For those that don't know what we're looking at, this is job approval rating of Biden, and Trump plays into it too, because look at the division compared to years before. Mm-hmm. If you were the opposite side of the aisle, you're below 20% approval rating. If you're the same side of the aisle, you're above 90%.
Yep.
This is not even close. Yeah.
That goes all the way back to W. Bush, and I mean, just look at. And this is why we were able to continue progressing as a country, is because not that long ago that difference was a lot smaller. So we understood each other a little bit better, and you didn't get these insane flip-flops. Okay, let me bring up these new stories here.
You should be able to share. I made you.
So let's start with. All right, so let's start with this one. All right, so you should be seeing an article from the Economic Times here.
Yes.
All right, so this is April 30th, 2020. Remember, we're all so obsessed with what happened today that we have lost our perspective on history. And we haven't been going through this all that long. And April 2020, it was still kind of fuzzy what was going on and why. And here you have a story about how China locked down internally. So this particular story is using data for car travel, and it's showing how the internally China was choking off travel to and from Wuhan, where the virus started. At the same time, telling foreign countries that wanted to implement travel bans in and out of either Wuhan in particular or China generally, that you're racist and you shouldn't do that. There's nothing to worry about. So at the same time that was happening, China was doing this. They were being duplicitous, is putting it nicely, and they were being aided and abetted by. Am I allowed to say what organization they were being aided and abetted by?
No, not. Yeah, we're still little. We could be. Although I did back us up on Rumble. So for everybody, I backed us up on Rumble with the same name, Social Distillation, and I'm working on locals. It's a little less user friendly. So working on Rumble and Locals as a backup. I heard BitChute wasn't good for creators, so
Okay,
those are
well,
the
that's
two
the
I've
only
been working
other
on.
one I'd looked at.
Yeah.
So this is using TomTom, which I didn't even know was still a thing.
Sorry.
So this is using their data to track travel. And let's switch to another similar
You could have just hit
story.
the tabs on yours. Since you had
Okay.
your browser up, you could just hit the tabs.
So this one is also from April of 2020, and it's talking about airline flights in particular, which is where I first heard about this, because I heard someone talking about this, and it made my ears perk up, and I said, "What is that true?" And I started digging and looking for it. So according to this article, back on February 4th, so really early on in the global awareness process of the COVID outbreak, the China's Civil Aviation Administration was requesting that local airlines keep
Remember, it's not
operating.
China. We can't say China.
China.
It's the C word that rhymes with vagina.
Okay. The unknown, the strange virus from an unknown origin.
Yes.
So they were telling airlines and airports to keep operating flights from countries that had not imposed restrictions. Meanwhile, they were imposing restrictions on domestic flights within this specific country, which shall remain nameless. And even this article, which is critical of this policy, still softballs what was going on there. Let's see. While taking stronger measures to ensure the virus didn't spread within, according to the latest criticism of the country's handling of the outbreak. Stronger measures is quite euphemistic. If anyone doesn't know, I don't know if you can still find it, but there used to be footage that you could find online of Chinese officials from certain country beating the crap out of people and dragging them back home. There was
I never believe it.
To enforce their quarantines. There was video of officials welding doors shut to keep people inside. And I don't know if you can still find this video or not. That's what they were doing internally. And remember, so this mentions, this one or the one before mentions that the outbreak started in December. There was actually, if you were paying attention, there were rumblings of it. There were rumors basically back in November that this was happening. And there was a doctor on the ground to person transmission. This is worse than what the news is reporting, and we need to take more aggressive measures domestically and internationally before this thing gets out of control. That guy disappeared. And then it was later reported that he had contracted the disease and died after the government was telling everyone there is no person-to-person contact, and you don't have to worry about anything. And remember, I'm old enough to remember. Oh, stop it. Go away. I'm old enough to remember when then President Trump instituted a travel ban in and out of China early on, and for flights to and from the U.S., and it was called xenophobic. So early on, this is an article from February, and it's the editorial board of the Boston Globe saying in the headline, Trump's travel ban is xenophobic. So the same people who very shortly thereafter were saying that he botched the handling of COVID were in February calling him xenophobic for instituting a travel ban. And we can keep, I don't want to share the video.
Yeah,
This was
just
one that
keep going on. Yeah.
this was one that blew my mind when I saw this. So if anyone remembers, if anyone's paying attention to the early reporting of the outbreak, there was a lot of concern about Chinese Lunar New Year because it was happening at the beginning of February. So you had a lot of travel to and from China as people visited family because it's a big deal in the Chinese community. So you had a lot of travel and you had a lot of big crowds, and you had while they were calling the Trump directive for a travel ban xenophobic, they were literally down in these crowds urging people to virtue signal basically and say, I'm not xenophobic. I'm going to go down and participate in these celebrations. How many people contracted COVID because of that? That's not the real point, though. The real point is how this completely flipped, because from the very beginning, this was a political issue. And here's another one from New York. So San Francisco, New York, it was happening all over, that people were being urged to go down to these Lunar New Year celebrations and show that
Pelosi and Cuomo? No.
shocking.
They're my
Yes.
heroes.
Shocking. So thousands of people took to the streets in Manhattan, defying concerns about a viral outbreak. So again, there were the beginnings of reportings in November. Starting in December, we started to get some pictures actually, and in January there was a lot of reporting about what was then an epidemic and concerns about it becoming a pandemic. And from the very beginning, here you have Bill de Blasio, governor of New York, saying, we know in China so many of our loved ones are facing the challenge of the coronavirus, but we stand together no matter what's thrown at us. This city is united. He's urging people to go down to the because there's a huge Chinese district in New York, obviously, and they have a huge Lunar New Year celebration every year, or did. He's urging people to go down there, and it's okay to be wrong, people. It's okay to be wrong. Three hardest words is I was wrong. But it's okay. But you have zero credibility if you don't own it. You have zero credibility if you said, man, we blew that. We said there was nothing wrong here. We urged you to go down to these Lunar New Year celebrations. We were completely wrong. This is what you need to do instead.
So do you get negative credibility if you harp on somebody else who did the same thing that you did? Or even
I think you do. I think you get negative credibility if you never ever admit to your mistakes and just flip, on a dime. Because to me, that's like lying. If someone lies to you, like a good friend, and they tell you a serious lie that really affects your relationship, it's always going to be hard to believe that person, because in the back of your mind, you're always going to think, am I being told the truth here? Because there was that one time that it was a big deal and they lied to me and it really hurt. Well, here you go. You've got the media and the Democrat Party shouting that there's nothing wrong here. And then just a little while later, they completely flip and start saying this is the worst thing ever, and we need to completely lock down everything. And Trump and the Republicans completely blew it. To me, I think you should have negative credibility on that until you admit, we messed up. Here's what we thought. Here's why we thought it. But here's what we think now, and here's why we think it.
I wasn't expecting that exact take on it, or I would have had prepared the video of Nancy Pelosi saying, To the extent of something to the degree, yeah, we would have passed this had our guy been in.
It's
And
that reminds me of something that when you were talking about Biden and his crime bills. But just before I get to that, if everything is political, you can't do that, because politics is the only true zero sum game. Because in economics, in science, as you said, you're not trying to be right, you're trying to be less wrong. In economics, you're always just trying to grow the pie. But in politics, you either win or you lose. You're either in power or you're out. It's basically the only true zero sum game. So you can, but especially in the media landscape, at least in their minds, you can never admit to wrongdoing. That's why we have political speak, because if you do, then you open a crack for attack, and if you lose, and you're out. There's no partial credit for a political campaign. You either win or you don't, and that's why. So something I thought of when you were talking about Biden and his crime bills. Remember, and then was that first or second debate, Kamala Harris went after Biden hard, literally called him a racist for his stance on busing,
and a rapist. Don't forget that.
Yeah. And then, and again, I should have had this quote handy, but I wasn't thinking about it at the time. Is she was asked about it when she became the VP pick, and she basically
said, a debate.
It was a debate.
It was a debate.
I mean, she's admitting to playing politics with those terms that we've been talking about. She's admitting to playing politics with the term racist. And basically, by never acknowledging their previous statements, these politicians and the media along with them are basically admitting to playing politics with something that they claim is all about the science and is all about doing what's best to save lives.
You just gave me the segue. We got to get into the science.
Yes.
Okay, so you gave me my direction too, because we're going to go into the data part of it, or just the basic breakdown, and then we'll go into censorship. The first, we got to ground in reality, and you brought up all the news stories, and what we've established up to this point, I think relatively well, and we'll keep doing, is the news is not reality. And as I said about the population data when it came to critical race theory, when it came to COVID, we got to go back to the beginning. And the key word in COVID with everybody is it's a novel virus. The key word is novel. It's new to us. But at the same time, when we look at viruses, we have a lot of data on how viruses, airborne viruses and stuff like that work. And even previous SARS-CoV viruses. This is SARS-CoV-2, we got SARS-CoV-1. And the disconnect here was we got tribes of scientist A versus scientist B when we never went back to, well, how do viruses work? How do airborne viruses work? If we had gone back to that, then we would have immediately said, well, probably didn't need a bat. Or, oh, my Amazon package probably isn't going to give me COVID-2 because it's already landed on cardboard and that protein has changed shape and all kinds of stuff. And so how do viruses work? What is a virus? That was an important question. And then going forward, what do the numbers actually say, and how do we evaluate population data? And over this shoulder here, that's epidemiology for health careers. So it's all about analyzing population data. And when we start looking at those things and then comparing it to what we're seeing in the media, we get a completely different story. And so let me bring up, I'm trying to decide what I want to start with.
Well, while you're looking at that, I'm looking at myself, and I just remembered while you've got intellectual books. I've got a dumb t-shirt and a hat. And one of my examples for how we're reacting to COVID is think about, don't be that annoying guy that tells me I can't be a Texas fan and a Boston fan. Don't be that annoying guy. Well, you have to choose one. No, that's not how it works. I'm allowed to be a Texas Rangers fan and a Boston Red Sox fan, and I have legitimate reasons for why I'm fans of both. And if they ever meet in the playoffs, well, then I'll have to evaluate which one am I going to support. And that's, to me, that's kind of an analogy of what we're talking about here, because and in terms of equal time, I should mention that there were and are a lot of right-wing sources that think COVID doesn't exist. It's all a news conspiracy. It's a false flag operation, all sorts of other craziness. It's okay to say, I think we've reacted badly to this, but it is a real virus, a serious problem. We need to address it. Something that we're not going to bring up because we didn't want to go down this rabbit hole is you and I watched a video for someone who made a lot of claims that might be a little out there, but one of the really legitimate points she did make was, but it was very serious to begin with. And the way you know that is think about how many stories and numbers you heard early on about doctors and nurses dying. And this was a doctor, a doctor with a great CV, and she was saying, if we can't protect ourselves, it's something serious, because this is what we do for a living. And if you think back to the early few months of the COVID outbreak, you do see that we don't have great reporting out of the original source because of certain governments which shall remain nameless. But from some sources that aren't government sources, it does seem like the outbreak there was really bad. And we do have good reporting from Italy, which was one of the first really bad hotspots, and it was really bad as far as deaths per thousand, and the reporting of the number of serious cases that required hospitalization and all that. But then once it got into other countries, it wasn't as bad. And in places where it was worse, like particular metropolitan hotspots, it was bad for a little bit, and then it petered out, and then recurrent.
There were a lot of confounding variables there. Yeah, there were a lot of variables there that correlate with the death tolls that came out in those countries. First of all, the CE country, they originally reported 40-ish year old men were the most likely to die. So middle-aged men were the most likely to die. And in Italy, they reported that they were having these massive death tolls, period. And in China, what people don't understand is the average middle-aged male has been a chain smoker since he was like 13. And the correlation with smoking and death from COVID is one of the highest correlating factors. And then in Italy, the other high correlating factor, being old, was part of the equation because it's the oldest population in the world. So we were looking at the morbidity and mortality rates. They were a lot of them were within a year predicted lifespan anyways. So the mortality rates were really bumped up from those two situations. You had chain smokers and then just old people, which were both high risk factors. Before we go on, I guess I should say that I've had COVID, as people who watched the last episode and saw me blank out would know. And I'm going to make a very bold statement here. The after effects haven't been that great, and we don't know about the morbidity, which is the non-mortality effects of a disease. and the brain fog is real, and I get some real headaches, and I'm a person who've never really had headaches before, and all of a sudden that was my first clue I had something weird. Was I had this massive headache that felt like it imagine tooth pain when you go to a dentist and someone hits a nerve, but then as a blanket over your head. That's what it felt like. It wasn't a pressure headache or anything like that. And then you lost smell and all that stuff. But the first clue was the massive headache, because I never get headaches. I don't get migraines. I don't get tension headaches. I don't get sinus headaches and all this stuff. But all of a sudden, I felt like someone was stomping on my head. And that still comes back, and the brain fog comes with it every time. A little less at a time, and hopefully it goes away. But we don't know the long-term effects. But at the same time, I would rather 5 years off the end of my life than live every year up until then, like we did this last year. That's the statement. I have the luxury of making that statement because I have no choice right now. But I still would I think I would make that statement even not knowing the final outcome. Living like we did the last year, and the way not only personally things went, but as a country, as people, as a world, as the entire infrastructure of the modern world, I would rather take 5 years off the end of my life and live the rest of it like that. Personally, that's my little sidebar there. Do you want to add to that before I go on to the numbers?
No, I don't want to get sidetracked talking about the politics of it any more than we already have, because I do think before we get into the politics of it, we do need to lay out the factual basis of it, that we're not just spewing our opinions here. We're giving you our opinions based on the data we've seen.
Yeah, let me start with on the larger scale, and then we'll work down to the individual. One of the major political parts of all this is lockdowns. You know, are we going to allow businesses open, or are we going to allow or are we going to allow our government to shut us down and control us? And we got to go to the population data. We're almost a year into this right now. We have data. And if we look at the top, do you have my screen there?
Yep. I'm looking at the Google results for cases here.
Yeah, and this is United States. So we've got our top 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, top 5 states in cases. And what did we see here? Blue, red, red, blue, blue. Top 5 for cases. And guess what? They're all relevant to their population, relative to their population. We go cases per million. North Dakota, South Dakota? Well, shoot. If there was only something the Dakotas had in common, they're cold. People stay inside. People are enclosed together. They're not outside interacting. Rhode Island, another cold place. Utah, I don't know why Arizona's there. Don't ask me about Arizona. Outlier.
Old people.
Old people. Well, this is just cases. This isn't deaths. But at the same time, total cases, blue, red, red, blue, blue, swing, swing. What do we have? We end up with basically a wash. If you're shut down, you're doing bad. If you're open, you're doing equally as bad. So why are we killing ourselves psychologically? Why are we killing ourselves economically? We're killing our kids. Guess what? Texas schools are open. Florida schools are open. California, New York, guess where your leaders are coming from in the next 10 years, 15 years? We have data. That's the population data. So if you're just going to take a common sense approach, look at what's happening over the population. We've got enough time where 2 different approaches are taken, and we have also controls with our swing states that have kind of been halfway in between. And everybody's doing the same.
And yet again, everything's political. If you look at the if you look at the left-leaning news, Andrew Cuomo has been praised as brilliant for his response to COVID, and yet Santos, the governor of Florida, has been excoriated. DeSantis has been excoriated for not not instituting lockdowns that are nearly as strict as what is going on in New York. And yet, if you look at the data, that narrative doesn't make any sense.
All right, so we're going to move on to excess deaths. So one of the biggest indicators of whether a pandemic, I guess one of the biggest debates was they're recording these deaths as COVID, even though they're not COVID deaths. So it's skewing the numbers. So what the biggest indicator we can look at is what we call excess death. And so this is total mortality across the US. And this is straight off the CDC website. So if they flag us for misinformation, this is off their website and it's updated today. Can you see the bar up on the top? Can you see my mouse moving? Okay.
Yep.
CDC.gov, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So we do see that there is actually excess death. And what we would find with the total is the area under the curve there, for those that like calculus. The area under the curve would be the total death, and everything over that orange line would be what's called excess death. So if you take the area of that curve, and I have it on an Excel sheet, which won't come up on our Zoom for some reason, but the area under that curve does not equal the almost 400,000 deaths they claimed for COVID last year. So yes, there is excess death. So we do know COVID was a factor. But if we knew the real number, would we be having the same discussions we're having now? That's the question. It was something around 120,000 versus the 400,000.
So you're going to have to explain that for those of us who are history dorks and don't know the sciences and the maths and when you say excess deaths, is that orange line the expected number of deaths based on previous data?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Now we're going to get into where I have a problem with this because it's going to get even more complicated.
Okay.
Because that is what the orange line is supposed to represent. And we can go back, we can look back. We had a really bad flu season. You look at that, the end of December versus almost to February of
2018.
2018
is what that is. Okay.
Yeah, we had a really bad flu season. And when you're looking at these numbers and you go to the databases, you're usually a couple years behind with actual numbers. 2018 would be the last year we had real numbers. And I went back as far as 2013 to get a trend line on this, and it was approximately 30 to 60,000 additional deaths each year of all causes, period. And in 2018, we saw only about a 25,000 death increase, and that includes that big spike there. Now, what I question here, and this is where it gets more complicated, is if you look at that trend line going across the orange line, it's pretty much level. But historically, we have a 30 to 60,000 deaths total increase every year. Why is that level going across? And actually, you see a little bit of a dip expected for 2020.
The peaks and trough across these 4 years do seem interestingly similar.
The other problem I have is in the recording, because we don't know the actual numbers. We just get preliminary data and they make estimates based on that. And did I do? No.
Yeah,
I
and
didn't.
to explain that for anyone who doesn't get that, that's like if you looked at the weekly number of homicides, you might get a really high number. Well, that's because homicide just means any death that isn't natural. But then you
Yeah.
come back a month or two later, and those numbers for this week would be different because there has been more analysis of those numbers. And now you can split off, okay, well, here's this was actually natural causes, this was suicide, this was self-defense, this was murder. So now you can parse out those numbers more exactly.
Yeah. And so, as the buzzword is for everything nowadays, we have an algorithm for that. And you see right here, typically they would use the Farrington surveillance algorithms, which I had to do some research on that, and that per the research was the most accurate up until recent history on estimating population data when it came to health. And especially for things like flu and airborne illnesses. So it was very specific to that. So up until recently, they used this Farrington surveillance algorithm. But for some reason, they decided to switch to what they're calling, oh, I lost it, but switch to a different algorithm. And if you read those paragraphs over and over again, and anybody can look at where my source is up there, the reason for switching algorithms, they don't really give, except that the Farrington algorithm gives a 25% lower number calculated. They don't really give any other reason for why they switched. So now I go back to our original chart. These are all 25% higher than would have been the typical standard equation they used. Is it more accurate or is it not? I'm not giving conclusions, I'm just asking questions. Should this trend line be higher because of the previous history of trend lines raising from 30 to 60%, or excuse me, 30 to 60,000 every year? Not giving conclusions, just asking questions. And my third question to add to that is, did they adjust all of this for the new equation? They never state in their methods. So if they adjusted all of this, and that's where they got the new line, then I'd say this is 100% accurate, and this is great. But until we get the actual numbers, which are somewhere around here in compiling, we'll never know.
And the point of the questions is what we were talking about in that long rambling preamble, which was if you can't ask the questions, then you're never able to merge those two sides, to merge those two viewpoints and say, okay, what's the actual truth? And more importantly, specifically on an issue like this is, and now what do we do about it?
Well, and that's the problem, is I've asked all these questions which haven't been addressed, but yet we're making federal policy based on the conclusions drawn irrespective of the questions I have asked. Which I think brings us to the other part, is scientific censorship. I wanted to talk about this with the audience because I don't know how much Heath understands, but people don't really understand how, let me rephrase that. The postmodern movements are correct in that society does control science to some degree. But that's not manifested in the scientific method, which is how it's being kind of presented at the point. But it's presented in what gets funded, what gets put out there, what gets made available to the public, who keeps their jobs and things like that. So some of the major ways that science gets censored is, first of all, is the job threat. So if you're most science is done at the university level. If you're a professor at a university and you want to tackle a controversial subject, you're kind of, unless you're, well, even if you're tenured anymore, you're kind of putting yourself out there and hoping you don't get fired for what you do. And a lot of people are going to be like, oh, that's ridiculous. But it's not so ridiculous anymore. I think one of the major examples of that is there's a columnist writer. She wrote a book, The End of Gender. Her name's Dr. Deborah So, and she was a PhD in sexual psychology. And she got out of academia because she could not pursue her studies on gender anymore. More specifically, I believe it was early transitions. So people who are 3 and 4 years old wanting to transition to the opposite sex because, oh, it's just socially constructed anyway, so we can make them a male out of a female while they're young so they don't have to go through those 15, 20 years of thinking that they're the wrong sex. And she had to leave academia, and thankfully she found her way in journalism. She wrote for Playboy for a while, and now she has a couple books out. But that was one of the things that really stood out to me, because the only option you have is to shut up or get out. And even if you get out, you get called a transphobe or whatever else names she's been called along the way.
And you would think that if wherever you stand on the issue, you should want this kind of research to be done. We're talking about kids here. You should want additional research on how it's going to affect. But you can't if you're in that the postmodernist or that black and white thinking, because it's either you wholeheartedly support this or you're a phobic. Mm-hmm. Well, no, I want to know what the data is. I want to know what we can learn so we can make better decisions.
Let me go back and say, everybody says follow the science. Follow the science. Well, this is why you can't always follow the science, because some of the science isn't available.
Yeah.
And reason number one is because a lot of scientists have to keep their jobs. So they put their head down and they follow the status quo. And one of the things that contributes to that is when you talk about heads of departments, it's an administrative position. So you would love to say that the head of the physics department at Oklahoma State University, where we went to school together, is a physics professor that worked his way up, but it's not. It's a specialist in physics education, which is a humanities degree. It's an education degree. So it's a PhD in physics education. It is not a physics scientist. It is not a biological scientist. It is not a psychological scientist. It is an education major. And right now, as we talked about before, the admin departments are taken over by these postmodern, philosophical, critical stance ideologies.
And this, so I don't know. I've never had to write a grant proposal, thank goodness. But I do know the general politics of it because I was immersed in that world. And so I do know, for instance, one of the criticisms inflated, because if you want a grant, the easiest way to do it is to link it to climate change somehow. So for instance, I want to study I want to study the cougar population. Giggity. I want to study the cougar population in Oklahoma. All right. So I can write up a grant proposal to get a grant to study the cougar population that may or may not get funded. However, if I write up the proposal in such a way to say, I want to study the impact of global climate change on the cougar population in Oklahoma, that is much more likely to get funded. And it inflates the numbers of science and scientists who agree with the consensus on climate change. And that's not a controversial statement. You can look at just a few decades ago, climate science grants were measured in the tens of millions, and now it's the hundreds of millions. And it shouldn't be. One of the things that's always driven me crazy about getting in debates on anything remotely scientific is having your science shot down by the person who disagrees with you because, well, this wasn't from a reputable source, and their idea of reputable source is a university. And frankly, universities are where most of the pure research, and by that I mean research for the sake of research, as opposed to like a company which will do research geared towards a specific goal. Most of the pure research in America is done at the university level. Well, it shouldn't be a controversial statement to say that universities are overwhelmingly left-leaning, and you don't think that's going to color. So I can't cite a study by someone who might have a link to, say, Exxon, because that's biased and that's not real science. But you can cite all the studies you want from universities that are blatantly political to the other side.
It's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
The leaning is, again, administrative. Now, the liberal mind does tend towards academia because it's always about exploring. And even in the STEM fields, someone who stays in academia versus becoming an engineer and working for Shell or something like that is going to be the person that's constantly exploring the possibilities within that realm. So you do have a left leaning there, but it's different. So again, it's the liberal mind versus the democratic mind.
Right. But
And
again, if you're right leaning, or even if you're just apolitical, you still have to navigate that left leaning.
and that's where admin comes in. That's where admin comes in. So you've got a head of your department who is of a political persuasion, and you've got to make them happy to keep your job. And you want to keep your job because you've got 2 kids at home and no other skills other than teaching physics.
Or maybe you just really love your work.
Or you just love your work. So you keep your head down and you put out what you have to put out. But you talked about grants. That's number 2. That's number 2 on my list of censorship. And what really brought that forward for me is we go back to COVID. One of the big things was treatment, HCQ, ivermectin, all of the treatments out there, which personally, when you talk about airborne diseases, I think we should have focused more on treatment than a vaccine, because airborne diseases keep mutating and changing, and we keep having to make new vaccines. Whereas if we have a good treatment, we can at least get the body count down. And that would be the main thing, just like we treat the flu or the cold or all of those things. But that's neither here nor now. But HCQ, I got a thing, hey, check this out. What do you think? And it was a sort of meta-analysis because there wasn't a whole lot done. But there were a few studies with a number of participants. It showed a little bit of promise. And when we saw the doctors go before the Senate hearing, it was pretty much the same thing. It shows promise, but it has to be mixed with these other things, which makes sense because it attacks the body in so many different ways. And it kept getting shot down. And I was asked about this. I said, well, it looks like it has promise, but more work needs to be done. And what it ended up happening was no more work was done because nobody funded. They couldn't get the grants. You look at ivermectin, has promise. We look at population data in third world countries where they're using it for parasite control and COVID numbers were better. Well, look, we got a little correlation. Let's study it more. Never got studied more because nobody will fund it. And when you have no funding, you can't, the opposition says hydroxychloroquine is HCQ, by the way, for everybody that's out there. Hydroxychloroquine has no scientific basis. Well, no, it doesn't, because it never got funded.
And also it's important to note that when people say it has no scientific basis, it means what they mean is there's no, what you were talking about, correlation versus causation. There's no causation studies, because in order to prove that, you've got to control the variables, which means you need a double-blind study with a controlled group so that you can really analyze what's going on here, and is it this or is it something else? Because all we have right now are basically, I won't say anecdotal, but you do have a lot of
case studies.
Stories.
Case study is a technical term.
Case studies, technical work, articles talking about we've used these anti-parasiticals to treat this, and we've had these results. Okay, but you can't really know, is it these drugs like hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, or is it something else, or is it the combination? Well, you don't know if you haven't done the rigorous double-blind studies that you do to really get these answers, and you can't do those unless somebody's funding them.
Well, there's two things that go along with it. We've never had the funding. I say we like I'm doing it. I'm not doing it. I have no part of any of these studies. Yeah. But if you don't have the funding, and we haven't had the time, so we would have to look at short-term results and things like that. Well, I wanted to go back to the statement of no supporting evidence. The problem is you can make that statement, but also when someone can say back to you, but you have no supporting evidence otherwise, you're at an impasse. Mm-hmm. It becomes an unfalsifiable statement. And what people don't realize is they only get, when they hear the words, there is no evidence to suggest this works, they don't hear the words, we've never tested it and we haven't seen that it doesn't work. And people automatically shift to that whole end of the spectrum, whereas there's no evidence that this works. So in their mind, they hear the words, it doesn't work. And at this point in the process where we had no idea what was going on and getting the long-term effects I've had, if someone had given me hydroxychloroquine, I would have taken it. It's better than nothing.
And this is all back to everything is political, and we can't have rational discussions with each other because, oh my gosh, Orange Man bad, and he talked about hydroxychloroquine, so it must be bad. And on the other side, there's absolutely nothing to worry about because Orange Man told me to take hydroxychloroquine. Well, okay, hold on here, people. There's something in the middle here that we could find if we could have a rational discussion about the data, which we're not allowed to have.
Well, and realistically, those preliminary studies, which would basically amount to case study with how little participation they were basically doctors trying it out and then writing papers. They showed promise. And when something shows you see something, you say, oh, it shows promise. We got scientific basis that this is how it works. The first question in scientific research when it comes to health and wellness is, does it make biological sense? What is the biological mechanism that would make it make sense? Okay, now let's test it. We had 1 and 2. And we were never allowed number 3 as a public. And I would like to have seen the end result, even if it said, you know what, they were wrong. That's great, because now we don't waste our time anymore. Funding is a huge way to censor, because if you don't, well, there's two parts to it. If you don't give the money, it doesn't get done. But if the companies that made hydroxychloroquine gave the money, then on the flip side of it, you would have said, well, look who sponsored it. They got a positive result, and look who sponsored it.
Yeah. And to which I go back to that story about Einstein of, well, if they were right, it only would have taken one. Okay, well, who cares who funded it? What's the data say? What was their was their methodology good? Because even if you don't understand the science, the particular science of the witchcraft of biochemistry, if you can look at what their methodology was, you should be able to figure out, okay, well, this looks hinky to me. This sounds goofy. Whatever. Maybe it's, wait, so you're saying it works, but you've only got like 12 patients here in this study and you excluded all these other patients. Why did you exclude all those? I mean, you should be able to figure that stuff out, even if you don't understand the biochemistry of it all. So instead of just the blanket statements of discredited, figure out why.
Another part of research is repeatability, and that's where time comes in.
Yeah.
So if we did a study and it was funded by a company that made the drug that you're studying and it came out positive, that would probably, in a normal situation, would spur some grad student somewhere to say, well, let's repeat that, and then get a government grant or something to do it. And you would get a second opinion on that same study. And you get a lot of our best work is repeated studies. So you get this, okay, we got this result, let's repeat it with a different population. Oh, we got the same result, let's repeat it again, maybe slightly tweak a variable, that kind of stuff. The third way that we get some censorship is with this new current diversity, inclusion, and equity. Oh, I'm gonna have to bring a screen up for this one. So
this makes my headache worse.
This makes me want to add to the body count. My hypothesis on the body count of the new science has already started. This makes me want to add to the body count because one of the things we would love to know is how we could better survive this pandemic. And we're on the verge. Is it cutting off with me and you there? Can we move our faces down? Is that better?
I've got a good view here.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the Oregon study, right?
Oregon Health Science University, I think that's what it stands for. They end their massive coronavirus study because it underrepresented minorities, the university says. Oh, I don't even know where to start here. It was projected to cost $24 million a year, track 100,000 coronavirus symptoms with 10,000 people, and it was all by volunteer. Now I do have I have a tab for this key Oregon study that's linked there, but I want to bring some points forward. It's a 2.4% random sample of Oregon's population. So this key, that's key. I'm going to highlight that. Random sample. So this was not made by anybody's preference or bias. It was a random sample. Those are key words. It was expected to help the state understand where the virus is most prevalent, catch new cases and outbreaks early, open schools faster, and help prevent future outbreaks. That's also important. Open schools faster. They're still not in school up in Oregon, by the way. But announced in May, they nixed the whole project because they said it wasn't representative of minorities. And we go to that key to Oregon study. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC. Research and Data Council basically deemed that it did not represent the minority population as well because they are overrepresented in the negative data as it comes to COVID-19. So let's go to their source. Here's their source. Here's the report, Oregon.gov. So I'm not taking this from some random Politico source or anything like that. I'm going to move our faces for the camera here. They were correct when it came to cases. More per 100,000, more per 100,000. But this is what we call cherry picking. That one number is how they base their analysis, which nicks the whole thing. But if we go a couple lines over, all equal and all equal. Those were, oh, it highlighted everything. Percent hospitalization and case fatality was equal across the board. They just took one number and said, oh, we're overrepresented. It goes back to our Super Bowl analogy. Remember, where if you go backwards on something, you can always find a demon. And they found that one thing they wanted to nix the whole thing because it didn't represent the population. The problem is, it did when it came to outcomes in fatalities and hospitalizations. And we have that original thing I brought up, random. It was a random sample.
What immediately jumps out to me about that, though, is hold on a second. You're doing this supposedly on behalf of minorities, but if they're overrepresented, wouldn't you want to know why? If they're overrepresented, wouldn't you want to actually say, well, then we need to focus in on this and discover why for the sake of these minority populations, not just say, well, just ignore it, just kill the study because that's racism. Wait, hold on. If you're right, then minority populations are more susceptible because you have a higher instance of cases per 1,000. So we should figure out why so that we can help these populations. Now, in the end, it turned out not to matter really, since the hospitalization numbers and the fatality numbers weren't much of a disparity. The other thing I noticed there that I didn't see was the percent of the Oregon population of those ethnic groups, because I feel like that would matter too in those numbers. And I didn't see that
was in there. Hold on. Whoops. I got rid of it.
Get back. But the other thing that when Sam reminded me of this study that I'd heard about a while ago, but when he reminded me of it, the other thing that jumped to my mind was, well, hold on. If you wanted to study something,
they just gave percent of total cases,
okay,
not percent of population.
But so by this logic, if you wanted to study the effects of sickle cell anemia in people with people of African descent, whether African Americans in the U.S. or just generally, you wouldn't be allowed to study that. But that's important. That's important data to know, isn't it? And just in general, and if you claim to care about minorities, then you should be supportive of something like that. But by this logic, it makes me think, well, no, you can't do those kinds of studies anymore.
Well, it's a narcissistic relationship. And one of the key characteristics of a narcissistic relationship is what you call a double bind argument. And to go to your sickle cell analogy, is you would see, say a scientist came along and said, we need to study this. It's 70, I'm making numbers up on this, but I do know it's more prevalent in people of African descent, but 70% African American, 30% everything else. So we want our population to represent that. The argument would end up being, well, you're keying in on this and calling them lesser people because they have sickle cell anemia. And so it would be nixed. On the flip side, if you did it per population and it was 12% Black, 17% Hispanic, 62% white, and then fill in the blanks, then you would get the argument that nixed this study, which was, well, there's a disparate outcome for Black America and you didn't study that. And so there's a lose-lose. That's a double bind argument, is a lose-lose. We got this with vaccinations. The original was we're going to do old people we're going to do health workers, then old people, then people with conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the argument was, well, the majority of older people are white, so you're discriminating against Black America. And then it was, okay, we're going to do essential workers because that will help fix that disparity. Oh, we're not going to be your guinea pigs. There was no win. There was no win there.
And that's what happens when you take this very rigid black or white view, black or white thinking, false dichotomy view of everything. And what we're talking about here, I mean, partly we're talking about it because the whole COVID situation just pisses us off because it has real tangible impacts on people's lives. And this skewed way of looking at the world has really negatively impacted a lot of, not just it's negatively impacted the whole country. And then you break that down and it means that you personally have been negatively impacted by this thing that you think is just academic or political and doesn't have anything to do with you. And what we're trying to show here is that, yeah, it does.
Well, I'm going to give a very obvious observation for people to think about. The states that are open versus the states, we'll call them areas, the areas that are open versus the areas that are closed, go along party line. You want to say follow the science? Everything has exactly the same outcomes. We discussed that earlier. Exactly the same outcomes, but open or close is along party line. That tells you everything you need to know about the whole situation. So we need to go back and say, what's a virus? What's an airborne virus? Look at the population data, and let's go from there. Let's study it. If we get a random sample, go with it. Here's a double bind right here. There's disparate outcomes between these ethnic groups, but we're all the same. You want me to study you as if we're all the same? Or do you want me to study you as if there's disparate outcomes? Pick one. You got to pick one because I've got to pick a direction here. I got two roads in the fork. Give me a direction. Disparate outcomes or we're all the same? I think we're all the same.
I don't even know where to go from there because it's such a horrible tangled mess, and we do want to get into the impact of the policies more because there is a lot of data on that too, and that's something we're not allowed to talk about. We've been on this one track. There's a narrative that has been established that has been trying to force all talking of this issue onto one track, and we're not allowed to say, I mean, a freaking year we've been doing this, and we're not allowed to say, hey, have we been wasting our time here? Hey, is there a better way to do it? Hey, could we even, we're not even allowed to say, can we modify what we're doing? No, it has to be like this. And when the experts from on high, but only the experts that we, the controllers of the narrative, have approved of, when they give us new directives, then we must follow those as rigidly and religiously as the previous ones, even if they're completely contradictory.
Yes, there's a narrative, and I think that's where we need to go next. Yeah, it's all about the narrative that we're being fed, and I think that's kind of why I really wanted to talk about the censorship of the health industry and science, is because they feed us a story and we trust them as experts. So, well, here's a good example, the CDC and sexual assault. So if you go to the book that I brought up last time, Are We Even Equal? And she talks about sexual assault numbers. Actually, she says rape numbers. 1 in 3 women are raped every year or in their lifetime. And I said, that's a lot. Her source was 2015 CDC. So I said, that's a pretty good source. And so I went to the source, and it was an article. First of all, she misrepresented her source. It was 1.5, according to the article. And then it was based on this randomly generated model on some weird statistical thing based on a lot of assumptions. And the next closest study was 1 out of 45. I did based on population data going back on rape numbers for the last 80 years. And if every one of those people was still alive, it would still be 1 out of 20. So probably the answer is somewhere in between. It's not 1 out of 3. It's definitely not 1 out of 3 because that was misrepresentation. It's not 1 out of 5. It may or may not be 1 out of 45, but it's still a huge number. And why they couldn't use the real number blew me away, because the real number is still bad. If it's 1 out of 45, then I could still look down my block and say, wow, there's 2 or 3 people on this block that have experienced this in their entire life. And that's still not good. But 1 out of 3 gets the mob going. Like I said, the truth doesn't get the mob going anymore.
But if you question those numbers and you question that narrative, then it's either, no, you agree with these numbers and parrot our talking points about how terrible this is, or you hate women and you're pro-rape and you're perpetuating a rape culture, whatever the hell that means.
We got a recent example. We've got someone who was in the Capitol, theoretically, during the time of the quote unquote insurrection. And she says, I was sexually assaulted before, and this was like that. Who's going to touch that third rail?
Yes.
Who's going to touch that third rail? She's known for making crap up to get her way, but no one's going to touch it, because if you're wrong, you're a horrible person. But if you're right, you're still a horrible person because you're questioning the act. And I think everybody knows who we're talking about, but I'm just going to say, in his satire, Gad's Head calls her occasional cortex. I think that's the best. The best.
That's why I like him.
Yes, he's a king of satire. But we're being fed a narrative, and I wanted to get back to that time. In between these little conversations we've been having, I keep going back to that damn Time magazine article, because it's a form of gloating, if you really think about it. They're telling you exactly how they manipulated. And it bothers me, because I brought up that graphic earlier where 97, 98% of Democrats think Biden's doing a great job and everything's peachy keen and the world's going to get back to unity. Don't confuse unity with uniform. I'm sorry. Let me bring up my favorite 2 paragraphs from that damn article so I can get it off my mind. This is the story of the conspiracy, their words. There's their header right there. The other title on there is from a current story, so don't think that's the title to this one. But this is the inside story of a conspiracy to save the 2020 election based on access to groups' inner workings, never before seen documents which they don't provide, and interviews with dozens of those involved from across the political spectrum. So we've got. Go ahead.
No, I was bringing something else up to point out. But let's stick with you're talking about the Time article here.
Yeah. It's the story of an unprecedented, creative, and determined campaign whose success also reveals how close the nation came to disaster. Which is, if you read the whole article, it means had Trump won, it would have been disaster. And again, quit making me defend this guy, because I didn't like him either, but at the same time, this pisses me off. Every attempt to interfere with the proper outcome of the election was defeated. The proper outcome, keywords, they use this throughout the article. The proper outcome was achieved, i.e. Biden won. It's massively important for the country to understand that it didn't happen accidentally. Someone made it happen. The system didn't work magically. Democracy is not self-executing. In a debate I had with someone on social media, they said, it's our job to find the truth and vote, and that's how it works. Well, apparently democracy, according to them, is not self-executing. You don't find the truth and make it happen. They make you make it happen by basically giving you the truth you know. That's the best way to explain it. The next paragraph is the one where it kind of gives me a little bit of the chills. The participants want the secret history of the 2020 election told, even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream. Huh, conspiracy theorists, paranoid fever dreams. Sorry, adding commentary. A well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies working together behind the scenes to influence perception, change rules and laws, steered media coverage, and control the flow of information. They just admitted to everything that was questioned during the erection squad debates for everybody to see. They were not rigging the election, they say. They were fortifying it. And they believe the public needs to understand the system's fragility in order to ensure that democracy in America endures. They didn't rig it, they fortified it. They made sure it was honest.
There's so much terrible about this article, but there's a couple things that really jump out to me right off the bat. First of all, imagine for a second a world in which Trump won with these kinds of tactics. Imagine there was, the evil Koch brothers and I don't know, Romney, I don't know, whatever other right-leaning
Romney was never Trumper. Romney was a never Trumper. Yeah.
I'm just trying to think of really rich Republicans off the top of my head. So imagine a bunch of really rich right-leaning people
Cruz,
came together.
Because he can go to Cancun while we freeze to death.
Or wait, no, who are the people that the left really irrationally hates? The Chick-fil-A and
oh yeah.
That home decor place that I hate.
Well, now Elon Musk too. So.
And Elon Musk, yeah. So suppose they all came together and they pooled several $1 billion together to make sure that Trump won using these exact same tactics. This is being reported by Time as obviously a good thing, and two, they're reporting this straight, like straight news. There's, as far as they're concerned, there's no slant here. This is, hey, this is just, horse race reporting. We're just talking about the political machinations of this, and this is a good thing, and there's nothing wrong here. So imagine, if you will, that this was flipped. How do you think it would be reported and received? That's one. And two, the other thing that jumps out at me is that this isn't new. What's new is how brazen and open they are about it. They're bragging about it. So back when I was still paying lots of attention to politics, and you weren't, so you might not remember a scandal back in Obama's first campaign called the Journo List. And I assume most people don't know what this is, so I'll give you a quick summary. The Journo List was a private list. It was a private Google group of something like 400 journalists that were all on this email group together. And I don't remember who broke the story and how it leaked, but somehow someone got a hold of some of these conversations. And basically, it was a cartel that was organizing the news before they reported the news. So it was a bunch of people who supported Obama in 2007 in the run up to that campaign, and they were all collaborating to frame the narrative in a specific way.
Well, I want everybody to read the quote I just put up. Read it, give you about 5 more seconds, and then I'm going to bring up this picture again. It turned out that once you said it out loud, people agreed, and it started building momentum. Tell a lie big enough, keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it.
And here you are back in 2007, where they had to keep this secret. And now in the election of 2020, and when was this article? This article was published a few weeks ago. This was in January, I think. So now here we are in 2021, and they have no problem talking about this out loud and bragging about
February 4th.
February 2021. Okay, so just not that long ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and not that far removed from when they had to keep it secret.
Yeah, and there was a lot of key points where they went a lot of the things that were supposed to go forth in the Senate hearing that never happened because of a stupid insurgency that came in, or the changing of the laws in states to allow mail-in ballots. What I brought up several episodes ago with the rejection rate of signatures. But there was a contradiction there because they found neighborhoods, and they state this in the article, they found neighborhoods where minority voters would not vote by mail because they thought it was insecure. So they created block parties to get them out there to vote in person. But the original reason to get everybody to vote by mail was the COVID lockdowns. But yet they found out the areas where it wouldn't be feasible to get people to vote by mail, so they got them all together in a big giant party. So there's a contradiction there. Oh, and that's why I wanted to couple this with the COVID stuff. Was it's pretty damn good timing that all these lockdowns in all these swing states and the mail-in voting and everything arrived around the time people were manipulating the information you got about why you should be doing things a certain way.
And again, keeping that narrative very narrowly focused, so that even after months and months where we had more and more data, months and months and months go by, and yet we're never allowed to question the narrative that we're on. We're never allowed to get off that railroad track and say, hey, maybe we could try a few other things.
Well, it's more subtle than that. It's just, again, where censorship comes in. You're not allowed to hear the other side. Yeah. So you get one thing over and over and over, and it's an entertainment. One of the big, everybody's like, why do you read science books all day instead of watching TV or Netflix, or, oh, this show's good or whatever? And I watch the show for an episode, and I'm like, they're thrusting politics in my face. The last good comedy was Lucifer. And the only reason that was actually halfway good was because the director is a slightly right-leaning director. So he didn't throw a bunch of politics in your face. It was just a good, I'm not going to call it wholesome, but it was a good, witty comedy. But you try to watch
wholesome like Tommy Boy.
No, oh yeah, that was good. When comedy was good. The sign of old age, when you remember when Saturday Night Live was funny. But I'm going to end this on a positive note. So we do have to cut this to an end point, though. We could probably ramble on. If we were sitting around a fire right now in South Texas with a cigar and a bourbon, we could probably go on till 3 a.m. But yeah. One of the positive things in all of this is, now that the left is eating itself, and I decided to do something like this, but your more public figures, they're kind of stuck where they are. they either get canceled or they do something about it, is they went after Bill Maher. We ended last time with Bill Maher, and we're going to end this time, I think, with him. They went after Bill Maher, and he got funny again. If you watch his stuff now, he goes after everybody for every bit of ridiculousness. He stopped towing the left line. Your typical evening host, where it was you walk out and you say Trump bad, and everybody laughs. And then he said something, and the left went after him, and he said, "Screw it." I take that as a positive. He can't. They're going to try to cancel him, but I think he's too big. And I personally think that's part of the resurgence of what is true liberalism, is the true liberal entertainers, comedians, satirists start actually fighting back. I even saw a bit on Saturday Night Live about cancel culture. I think it was a week or two ago, and they were coming back on it. So I think somebody came after them, and I hope that's a sign. I hope that means they're starting to fight back too. We're going to have comedy again.
And I hope that gets some of those people to say, oh, when I was personal and ad hominem to the people who disagree with me, maybe I shouldn't have been quite so vicious. Maybe we can actually come together on a few things, even if the only thing we can agree on is we should be allowed to speak our minds, because that's something foundational.
And it's going to be an uphill battle because of where the power lies right now. Not to sound like a Marxist with the oppression hierarchy here, but New Hampshire is fighting to get critical race theory out of their government policies as well as their schools. And James Lindsay was just on the panel with the legislature and everything. And the argument against him was, you're a white supremacist. There was no other argument against him. The argument was, if you oppose this, you are a white supremacist. Read the actual documents. I'll link the document in the in what we might have to clip this one into several, because I think we've been talking for like 2 or 3 hours here.
Yeah.
But I'll link it in whatever one you hear this on. The actual document, and it's the same as the executive order by Trump that they called getting rid of diversity training, which it wasn't. It was getting rid of diversity and not diversity, getting rid of stereotyping and scapegoating. So there's a big difference, and I wish people would see the difference. I wish people would actually look at the difference. Why we're here is because a lot of working class people don't have the time to look at this stuff the way we do. I really don't have the time. I just don't entertain myself anymore, because I figure if I'm going to be doing politics, I might as well be studying it instead of watching it on TV.
Because we're old and crotchety.
Yeah. So.
Which is a good place to leave off. And I think a little tease for next time is we're going to keep going down the COVID route a bit and talk about the tangible impact that this narrative and this false dichotomy put us on, and what that led to.
Oh, do we want to add my clip on how clipping things is bad? Because it's part of the narrative discussion.
Let's save that for next time. I think we open with that next time. Let's tease that.
Okay.
And open with it next time.
Yeah, I'll do what you said, and I'll make the slides.
Yeah.
So nobody can make me a racist.
Clip us overnight when we're talking about clipping.
It's been done. I told you they did it to Sam Harris. So
yeah,
it's been done.
Yep.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
So long, folks.